Hello and welcome to Never Mind the Bar Charts with myself, Mark Pack. And I'm delighted to welcome on the show this time one of our all-time favourite guests, Professor Tim Bale. Long-time listeners may remember Tim has been on the show, in particular a couple of times in the last Parliament, talking about what opposition parties need to do to be successful. Well, I think there's a handful of opposition parties who can claim they've been successful. So to look back at those lessons with me is Tim once again. Welcome back, Tim.
Thanks very much, Mark. Great to be here.
And I won't put you on the spot by asking you to reel off from memory all 5 lessons. I will read them out as we go through. But you identified 5 criteria that from history and political science and so on pointed to what an opposition party needed to achieve to be successful. And the first you mentioned was the need for fresh faces, signifying a generational change, not necessarily a change to younger people, because actually at the time we first talked about this, Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn were all signifying change, but not in a youthful way. And I guess certainly for Labour, looking back at the last Parliament, that's very much what they achieved with Starmer. With the Lib Dems, with Ed Davey, it's a little bit more complicated story because Ed was a figure from, minister in coalition. But yeah, fresh faces. How do you think Labour and the Lib Dems did on that?
Well, I mean, obviously, you have made a very good point that, particularly when it comes to the Lib Dems, you can't argue that Ed Davey, came as a bolt from the blue. Many people would have known that he was a minister in that coalition government and he'd been around for quite some time. On the other hand, as you well know, the attention that most people pay to politics would mean that, as far as they were concerned, they probably didn't know who he was when he became leader. So I think, in some senses, ignorance is is useful for political parties because
I wonder if it was that or if it was something slightly different. Because I think certainly one thing I learned, possibly from you many years ago, was that basically voters notice a lot less than you think, but they remember it for a lot longer than you expect.
Yeah,
And I wonder if though the issue with Ed was partly, as you say, maybe levels of political knowledge, how many did know that he'd been a minister. But also, in a way, the reason people remember things for a long time is because they don't notice much. And so nothing else comes in. And then, in a way, particularly through the very moving story that he told in the first party political broadcast in the election, Ed and the party gave people something new, something different to know about him. And that it's perhaps not so much that you just have to let time pass, but you have to give people a new story. That's the only way of displacing the old story.
Yeah, and I think that was very important, actually, of course, for Ed Davey, because the only thing that people had heard about him, I think, in the run-up to the election was, of course, the post office scandal. And in some ways, one might have expected that to do rather more damage clearly than it did. But I think that alternative narrative that, as you say, came through from the party political broadcast and many of his interview appearances during the campaign really did in some ways kind of blank that out. And of course you have to point to his antics, as some people have described them, but his very photogenic campaign as doing in some ways exactly the same thing. And certainly I think that did make people sit up and take notice of Ed Davey in a way that they wouldn't otherwise have done. But we can come back maybe to that.
And there's an interesting point there about how the media operates, isn't there, in that for all that there is often quite a strong sort of small p, sometimes capital P, political editorial tone, particularly to newspapers, there is also an absolute love of good pictures and good video footage. And you saw this with, say, The Telegraph, which was definitely not, from an editorial point of view, friendly to the Lib Dems during the election, but they just couldn't resist publishing really big, nice, colourful pictures of Ed, because that's what... And in that sense, the need of the photo desk trumped the political inclination of the editor. And that's, I think, an interesting nuance to how actually media influence plays out.
I think that's right. I mean, whether that tactic can be used again, I'm not sure. I mean, it does make you wonder what he could do to sort of top the bungee jump, for example, that he did in Eastbourne, where, of course, I live.
Yeah.
I was very disappointed I didn't hear about it.
Oh no, you missed the opportunity.
In time to drive over to Eastbourne Borough and see him do it.
I'm sure if you ask the new MP for Eastbourne nicely, he'll organise a charity bungee jump that you can take part in, Tim.
Yeah, I'll get on to Josh about that. I mean, I think you're right, though. Labour, I think, did do that very well.
Mm,
I think Starmer, although clearly not a particularly inspiring figure, was seen as a departure from Corbyn. Of course, he did a lot to, help that by getting rid of Jeremy Corbyn from the party. But he also, I think, projected an image of, a safe pair of hands, someone you could see as an alternative prime minister, and he wasn't someone that most voters would have been aware of unless they had followed the kind of Brexit story, where he was, Labour's minister, shadow minister for Europe. So, I mean, I think that did work very well for them. It really was a kind of, Labour under new ownership
mm. And what did you
strategy.
make of the visual backdrop? Because Keir Starmer, in many ways, did a tour of smaller football grounds.
Mm,
If you want to think of your archetypal Keir Starmer or Ed Davey moment, the Ed
mm,
Davey moment will involve falling into water in some way.
mm,
The
mm,
Keir Starmer moment, I guess, would be him surrounded by poster holding Labour people, stood on the pitch next to a football stand. That was clearly a very deliberate presentational choice, given that that was, he kept on going back and again to football grounds.
Yeah, and I think that had to do really with Labour's strategy, which was about not piling up votes in
Mm,
big cities and actually going to some of the kind of smaller towns in England in particular. And, that turned out to be quite a successful strategy, obviously. One of the reasons why, as many people have remarked, and we might talk about later, their vote share wasn't that great, but their seat share was fantastic. I mean, it obviously did work very well. I mean, in terms of the other parties, I think the Greens obviously, in some ways, have got an advantage in that there was only one person who anybody who paid any attention to politics would have known about, and that was the MP for Brighton Pavilion. And since she was retiring, almost anybody who stood for the Greens was going to be a fresh face.
mm,
And I think they were lucky in Carla Denyer. She,
mm.
clearly was a reasonably, charismatic figure and
Yeah.
able to carry herself well in debates, etc. And I think that worked very well. I mean, and actually coming back to the Lib Dem campaign, I thought Daisy Cooper actually did well as well in that
Mm.
sense. And again, she wouldn't have been someone that most people, who don't pay much attention to politics would have noticed before. But the fact that she, appeared on TV quite a lot, I think was an advantage
Yeah.
as
And the
well.
fact that she hadn't been a minister in coalition government actually meant that when she was being put on the spot, it's a little bit easier than
Yeah,
if you're being directly asked about your own previous.
yeah, I
I
think,
guess the other sort of uh, successful party leader, unfortunately, from my political perspective, was Nigel Farage, who's
yeah,
obviously very much not a new face, but I guess he is, in one sense, a new face in that for people who are attracted to voting for him, part of that attraction is that they see him as being new and different from the
yeah.
sort of. Now,
I think,
obviously, critics like me would say, no, look at his look at his childhood, look at his career, look at everything about him. He is
mm,
establishment all over. But
mm,
clearly, for people
mm.
who he appeals to, they take a different
Yes, and
view.
I think in some ways, perhaps perhaps we need to reformulate because I think maybe fresh isn't necessarily the right word, but different, I think, is the right word.
Mm,
Yeah, he comes
yeah,
over as disruptive. I mean, I think also the fact that he really was standing for a
mm,
constituency that he stood a chance of winning made him look a bit different actually
yeah,
as well. The fact that he kind of did the big launch in Clacton. He was there a few times. I think that in some ways did mean that he was a slightly different kind of Nigel Farage in some ways. I mean, same old Nigel in some ways, but I think when somebody is actually competing for a seat and is associated with a particular locality, that does change things a little
yeah.
bit.
So moving on to the second factor, which you'd identified before, was the importance of unity and discipline.
Mm.
Um, and I guess the moment that perhaps best captures this is if you look at the polling on whether the public thought a party was having a good week or a bad week, or whether that campaign was going well or not. Labour is pretty unexcitingly flat at mediocre numbers all the way through, which I think they would have been quite happy with. We start well ahead. We don't want it to go wrong. Just another week where nothing much happened. Tick. with the one exception, there's a very clear dip in the week in which, and presumably because of the fuss around Diane Abbott. Now, obviously, it people often read causation into polls where it isn't. I think on this case, though, we can be pretty confident that that dip was due to the Diane Abbott fuss, which in a way perhaps reinforces the unity. And likewise, on the Lib Dem side, we've certainly internally had our debates, about what our approach should be through this parliament. But I think it's huge credit to everyone that when it came to the crunch, people said, well, okay, this is what we're doing. Let's just all give it as good a go as possible, and
Yeah.
then be pleasantly surprised at the outcome.
Yeah, and I thought the message discipline actually in the Lib Dems was really impressive. I mean, because Ed's strategy did come under quite a lot of media criticism, but you never heard a Lib Dem candidate or MP criticise it, even if perhaps privately they might have worried a little bit about it. And I think also they were also always able to say, well, actually, he's making a serious point by falling off a paddleboard. He's talking about sewage. That's
Yeah.
a big issue.
Sorry, I should keep an absolutely straight face while you're saying that. But I mean, I just feel in a decade to come or so, we'll all look back on this election and just think, what?
Well, yeah, but I mean, I do think that, they were able to make that link. They were able to make a link to an
Yeah,
issue that
absolutely.
was important to
Yeah.
people in constituencies that they were fighting.
And before a member of the Lib Dem press team WhatsApps me angrily, I absolutely agree with you for the record, Tim. But I thought what was interesting as well in that sense was it gave, all politicians to an extent have to play the media's game to get the media's attention, and then get frustrated when the media says, "Oh, but why aren't you?" And it's, I think Sean Kemp, a former Lib Dem special advisor, describes it as being like a dysfunctional family, that you all have to get on with each other, but also all spend your time bitching about each other in terms of the media and politicians.
Yeah.
And I thought what worked really well about, Ed's approach was it gave that opportunity to say, well, look, I want to talk about serious issues as well. It's up to you whether or not you want to. And that made it defensible in a way that something that had purely been, played for the laughs and the splashes, wouldn't have been.
Yeah, I agree. Interestingly, Reform UK, they did have some problems. I mean, clearly, there was some difference on the Putin question between Tice and Farage, although, Tice tried not to row back from what Farage had said, but, it was pretty obvious to anyone who was listening closely that, they didn't think the same way on that particular question. And of course, Reform also had to cope with the fact that lots of their candidates were exposed as saying some pretty dodgy, sketchy stuff, to say the least. But Nigel Farage has that sort of Teflon quality that he was able, obviously, to suggest, I mean, to me, ridiculously, but, the fact that he'd come in late, he had nothing to do with, their vetting. They'd paid the vetting company and they hadn't done the work. And, he just is not held responsible in a way that most leaders would be for, things that his candidates say or do. Quite remarkable, really. Whether that can continue in the same way, I'm not sure. And whether Nigel Farage can actually lead, his four fellow MPs without them falling out with each other over the course of the Parliament will be interesting to see. I mean, I actually do think in some ways it was quite lucky for Nigel Farage that he only came in with four other people. I think if he'd come in with sort of 20 odd other people, we'd have seen them falling out, far faster than we might. And already, obviously, he's got problems in the sense that he, suddenly promoted Richard Tice to be deputy leader, and Ben Habib, who was the deputy leader, didn't get into Parliament, wasn't told anything about it, and obviously feels very aggrieved.
Yeah, I guess there's a certain parallel with Boris Johnson. I think that both Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson have a style that, when it works for opponents frustratingly well. Of, how are they getting away with that type thing? But there's the risk, as we saw with Boris Johnson, when it stops working, it really stops working.
Yeah.
And it was it was very telling. I think if you look at the election literature, Boris Johnson's face featured heavily on lots of Lib Dem election literature, and that tells you something about how the public, view him. And when and so that, well, it all happened before me. It's not my fault. I'm not the one responsible. So when that works, it works, can work, effectively. But then when it stops working, it just sounds really, really awful.
Yes, it does. I mean, on Johnson, I do find it fascinating, and this is a slight byway, how conservatives, or many conservatives anyway, still regard this man as an incredible electoral asset when actually the polling suggests that that is far from the case, but they do continue to believe it. And as we've got some numbers out from our survey of Conservative Party members, and he's still, for some people, it would be the ideal leader of the Conservative Party, which is
If
remarkable.
I don't think you asked about how many would vote for him if he stood in the Tory leadership election, but do you have some other figures about how popular he is with Tory
No, we
members?
did.
Oh, you did. Sorry, I
We
missed
did
that.
actually ask, yes, and he gets from memory, I think something like 20%. I'd have to look.
Yeah,
But we asked the question in different ways. We gave people a write in to begin
yeah,
with, so they didn't have a list.
yeah.
Then we gave them a list of people who could stand, and then later on we gave them a list of people who could stand, plus Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage. And actually, some people even voted for Nigel Farage. So Johnson though does have something special for Tory members.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess, he is, and possibly will be for quite some time, the last Tory leader to have won a general election. And I think that does
Hmm.
give you a little bit of sort of cachet and standing, just as, in the Lib Dems, having been the leader at the point at which we got the most MPs, definitely has been, there are many other positive things about Charles Kennedy, but that's definitely been a bit of, oh, well, if they were the one then they must have been good. There's a
Yeah, I think that's true. I just looked up the numbers actually. Yeah, Boris Johnson got 20% of Tory members when we added him to the list, and Nigel Farage got 10%.
yeah.
So
I think if you'd polled Lib Dem members, many more than 20% would have said, yes, please, can we have Boris Johnson as the Tory leader? So it's and I guess the other thing around the sort of unity and discipline point as well, which we've fascinated to see how it plays out, is other than Diane Abbott's moment, Labour was really ruthless with its candidate selection
Mm, mm.
overall, but then has won so many seats that I suspect its wins have gone a bit further than its ruthlessness may have, at least in the full intensity of the ruthlessness. So do you have any sense as to how difficult or not that sort of parliamentary unity and discipline is going to be for Labour?
Well, I mean, they're not an opposition party, obviously, but I think one interesting thing to look at is, for example, the number of MPs who were elected with considerable green belt territory
Mm,
now in their constituencies. And of course, if you're planning major planning reform, that could be a problem for the Labour government, and indeed it could be a problem more generally for the Labour government that there are some, if you like, Labour MPs for NIMBY Central in a way that wasn't true before.
yeah.
But we'll have to see how that plays out. I mean, I suspect that even those Labour MPs realise that planning reform and building housing is such a big aspect of Labour's overall offer that they probably won't kick off about that. But we'll
Yeah.
see. I mean, obviously they've got problems already with regard to the two-child policy, so we'll have
Mm,
to see how that goes. And of course, in some ways, that's what the other opposition parties will have to think about. Where are the cracks in that huge Labour sea of faces? That wall that they face in Parliament that they can drive wedges into on policy issues that do actually matter, and the two-child one is a very good example of that.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see as well what happens on health and social care, both because of
Mm,
their importance in their own right, but that having been really central to the Lib Dem campaign, and potentially the question about how far is the government going and how quickly to improve things may well become a fracture line within the Labour Party, and so that
yeah.
dynamic between Lib Dems
Mm,
and Labour backbench MPs may be
yes.
part of the story of this
Yeah, I was
parliament.
in Brussels yesterday talking at a think tank and an event on what the election means as well as how it played out, and several people, obviously from European countries, were interested in the fact that you have a big Lib Dem
Mm,
contingent now. You've got 72
mm,
MPs who, while Europe wasn't made a great deal of during the Lib Dem
mm,
campaign, will be the most
mm,
pro-European in Parliament, and therefore the pressure on Europe which we've got so used to coming from the right against any government, is now probably going to come from, the centre, or the progressive left in some ways. And it will be interesting to see, whether that does actually make a difference to what the Labour government does. Not only, of course, are many Labour MPs very pro-European, their membership is very pro-European, and then you have a big Lib Dem contingent. We'll be pushing them on that as well as on social care.
And I do wonder where the Conservative Party will end up worrying about most. I think, even at least from what one can see from the outside, even after the results, it feels like the Conservative Party hasn't yet really woken up to, well, maybe we've got a London and Surrey and Hampshire and Sussex and Wessex and issue.
Yeah,
And
Oxfordshire. Yeah,
if
yeah.
if that's part of how the Tory party sees, its future, and we've got a problem with basically this big bottom right corner of the map, basically,
Mhm.
then given over, generally those places will quite heavily Remain voting, and given that even Tory support in the past, had a very, very big Remain strand to it, is the Tory party going to want to be bashing on about betrayal over Brexit every other week? There are certainly some parts of the Tory party that will want to be. There will be numerous Daily Telegraph columnists who will absolutely want to be. We already seen a Daily Mail front page, along those lines. But I mean, that's the bit in a way that most intrigues me. And I did, I can claim credit to have written a little bit about this before polling day. But it's like when the Tories lost control of their last district council in Surrey, you sort of feel there's something going on here that surely is as symbolic as the Red Wall, but
Mhm.
that nobody in the Tories seems to be that worried about.
No, I mean, I think that goes back to this obsession they have with, what they refer to, using the definite article as the realignment
Mm,
in 2019, and trying somehow to revive that,
mm,
and obsessing in some ways now, obviously, about reform and Nigel Farage, which it strikes me means that they are not necessarily looking completely the wrong way, but they really do need to be thinking about, the losses that they suffered in the south of England. I mean,
mm.
they cannot possibly be relaxed about, how many Lib Dem MPs there are in those areas, with, as you pointed out recently in your blog, actually very significant majorities in some cases that
Yeah,
are going to be very difficult to overturn next time around. Now, in some ways, what's worrying me, who wants to see the Conservative Party at least, be a force in politics, because I think it's useful that we have a,
and
you know,
because you're good at writing books on it.
well, yeah, none to do with that. Yeah. What worries me is that actually, I suppose it could even contribute to a degree of fatalism. The fact that some of those Lib Dem MPs have got such big majorities might make the Conservatives think, well, it's just not worth it. Why do it? I mean, in Eastbourne, for example, Josh, won over 50% of the vote, and I used to say to people, well, I live in a Lib Dem Conservative marginal, but I'm not sure I can say
Yeah,
that anymore.
yeah.
So they do need to worry about that, and think about how they're going to get that back, and how, as you say, if they follow the Daily Mail, they follow the Express, they follow the Telegraph down that, absolutely blind Eurosceptic route, whether that, is a dead end.
Mm. And I think it's worth giving those figures because, one of the definite reactions from some people has been, oh, well, the Lib Dems and Labour won lots of seats, but that was because Reform was splitting the vote. So Patrick Dunleavy very helpfully did the number crunching, and I'll include a link in the show notes. But if you look at the number of Lib Dem MPs elected with more than 50% of the vote, there were 19 of them. So, that in itself would have been, given how many MPs we started with, that in itself would have been a pretty good number. And then you add to that a further 36 who were elected with more than 40%.
Mm,
And, in a multi-party first past the post system, actually over 40% is really enough to win under your own steam. You're not
mm,
being gifted
mm,
the seat by a lucky
mm,
vote. And that was a further 36. And then there are 17 Lib Dem MPs who won seats with less than 40% of the vote.
mm,
But that's a lower proportion. So that's 24% of Lib Dem MPs, one with under 40% of the vote. That compares to 30% of Labour MPs. So not that much more for Labour. Labour, again, actually have got some quite big majorities. But for the Tories, 81% of their MPs were elected with less than 40% of the vote.
Yeah.
And you sort of think, that now that maybe is where splitting with Reform, uniting with the right helps prop up those
Mm,
MPs.
mm.
On the other hand, that shows that for all that this was a bad result for the Tories, my goodness, it's a very the number of MPs they have is not, holding on to their rock solid seats. It's a very fragile, you know.
Yeah, yeah, those Lib Dem and to some extent Labour numbers as well are really interesting in the sense that it can't, particularly with the Lib Dems, obviously, it can't be about incumbency because so few of them were
Yeah,
MPs beforehand. So I mean, they've come from zero to hero really very very quickly, and whether that is a function of a very volatile electorate and therefore can be reversed quite quickly, we'll have to see. But
yeah.
I
I mean,
think
I,
it's
I was I used to be quite proud of the vote share increases in the sort of seats I've been a campaign manager for in previous general elections, and I must admit, looking through the Lib Dem results this time, I just said those were pretty pathetic vote share increases I got. I should say the candidate and the team that I was working with, secured. It really of a very different scale.
yeah,
The sort
yeah.
of vote share increase that would have made you the most brilliant campaign in the whole country
Mm,
a
mm,
couple of elections ago, or even say in the 1990s, which just doesn't
mm,
would barely register on the
mm.
scale of it.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, this takes us back to opposition parties, doesn't it? And the
Mm,
extent to which obviously this election was about an anti-Tory mood. And I guess there's always a question about how much opposition parties actually can contribute to that anti-Tory mood or to an anti-incumbency mood, or how much they just ride it and take advantage of it. It's I think there's always to some extent it's a combination of both.
yeah, I do also wonder, and long-term speculations after an election are notoriously inaccurate. And
That's what
I've
podcasts are for, though. So
indeed,
yeah.
and I've mentioned this before about how I like reading books about election one, elections in arrears, because that gives you a bit of context. But I think there is an interesting challenge for the Tories now, that if you think about the reasons people didn't vote Tory, what can you do in opposition to start to overcome them?
Mm,
And perhaps in hindsight, the Labour's defeat in 2019 was not quite so bad as it seemed at the time, in that one of the major reasons people didn't vote Labour was Jeremy Corbyn. And so now, in hindsight, what we should have been saying in January 2020 was, okay, it looks like an awful result, but great news for Labour. The main thing they need to change is very easy to change. And in fact,
mm.
Jeremy Corbyn has already set it in train.
Yes, yes, and
Um,
also Brexit is going to get done whether you
yeah,
like it or not. So you've taken
yeah, you've taken away the Tory prop, you've taken
yeah.
away your bird. Let's just edit that. I'll stick a January 2020 date stamp on it, and we'll link to it, Tim, and claim our foresight.
No, no,
And
no. Very good point. I mean,
yeah,
also, I mean that does then, bringing us back to what opposition parties can do, pose this question about if, you know, actually what happened to the Conservatives this time around was to some degree a competence shock,
mm,
to use that jargon.
yeah,
And actually, it was simply that people just thought, these guys do not know what they're doing. We have to get some people in who've got some idea about what they're doing. How do you project competence as an opposition? I think actually Labour, in some sense, is an object lesson of how to do that over the last few years. I mean, I think Starmer and Reeves in particular did an awful lot to project that kind of competence. And in some ways, I think they've had to trade off their freedom of manoeuvre in
mm,
government in order to do it. And we're seeing that now in some ways with their problems over the two-child policy. I mean, it is in some ways a completely irrational thing to say that we're not going to do this. It costs a lot of money when actually all the evidence points to the fact that it would pull an awful lot of people
mm.
out of poverty. And yet, they made the decision to do that and to do various other things, which, as I say, limits now their freedom for manoeuvre to project the idea that they were safe, they were competent, etc. And I think
Yeah.
the Conservatives are going to have trouble doing that, you know, given the shock that they've suffered, and given it's quite difficult in opposition actually to prove you're competent because you can only say stuff, you can't really do stuff.
Exactly. And I think this is in part the Lib Dem problem post 2015, is
Mm,
if people feel that you have betrayed their trust in some way,
mm,
in any normal or even abnormal circumstance, if you're talking about rebuilding trust with somebody, that has to in part come through evidence of deeds.
Yes.
But
Oh,
if you're
well,
an opposition, and you're particularly if you're a small opposition, nobody's paying attention to what you're doing. You've got
yeah.
and I guess the hope for the Tories is that Starmer-Reeves combo managed to do it within one parliament. The
Yeah.
nightmare for the Tories is rebuilding competence in the past. So Labour under Kinnock and then Blair, the Tories post ERM, that took a long time and lots of defeats. And in a way, maybe it's a bit churlish to suggest, but actually Starmer and Reeves didn't achieve that much on that front. They succeeded relative to the Tories. Their
Yes.
success in rebuilding competence, in Labour was really about the comparison with the Tories. That
Yeah.
on its own, Keir Starmer's ratings were not brilliant, but
No.
compared to Rishi Sunak's, they were
Yeah.
massively better.
Yeah.
And so if the government doesn't massively mess up, and of course it might do, but if the government doesn't massively mess up, how do you rebuild a sense of competence
Mm.
in anything less than a decade? But then
Yes.
all
And
of
it,
these, the
yeah.
party X is doomed
Yeah.
predictions almost always turn out wrong. So
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm afraid, one possible outcome of that difficulty is that the Conservatives turn to other issues, other approaches that
mm,
don't emphasize
mm,
competence because they don't feel that they can do that or do it very successfully. So they just go even further down the kind of culture war route in order to make up for the fact that they can't really do very much about that competence or trust deficit. And I think that will just do them even more
yeah.
damage.
And I mean, in a way, that's slightly the story of William Hague's time as Tory
Mm,
leader after the
precisely.
landslide defeat in '97 through to him losing then
Mm,
in 2001, was he initially tried a bit of the modernising
mm,
competence tack.
mm.
And actually, if I remember rightly, Labour accounts of the time where they were quite worried when the "you've paid your taxes, where are the nurses" sort
Yeah.
of type campaign started appearing, of attacking Labour over competence, of saying,
Mm,
well, look, you've paid up your money. We're not attacking the fact that they've raised your taxes, but we are
mm,
attacking the fact that you wanted better public services. Where are they? And so it was a very public service, quality of public service
mm, mm,
oriented approach, not a traditional right wing approach.
mm.
It didn't really work. And in
No.
the end, William Hague did revert to
Yeah.
the,
Yeah.
vote
Because
Tory to save the
exactly, they won't
pound,
get any
etc.
traction on the issues that in the end matter more to voters. But if you can't get any traction on those, then inevitably you turn to things that don't really matter that much, but you're a little bit closer to the public on, which, was the case with regard to, saving the pound, et
Yeah.
cetera, much
Hence my
bigger.
slightly acerbic tweet that in the election, the Lib Dems were campaigning on sewage leaking into hospitals and the Tories on the lanyards being worn by doctors in the hospitals. But I think that does capture a
Yeah.
sense
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
which I'm not going to be able to wait until the next election before I read books about this one, because I just did the Tory campaign have no market research? Was they ignoring it? Was it completely, just what was the world in which they thought basically ignoring the NHS all the way through the election was the
Mm.
right choice?
Well, I mean, to be honest, if you look at elections past, the Conservatives do tend to steer away from the NHS if at all possible. I think you'll remember in 2019, for example, Boris Johnson made it so obvious that he was trying to do so that he took a reporter's phone
Yeah.
off them when shown a
But
picture
he
of a
also
child sleeping
promised
on the
new
floor.
hospitals. He said, get Brexit done and you'll get the NHS better.
Oh,
And
that's true. That's
that
true.
was,
Yes,
the
to some
Brexit, that
extent.
was the whole Leave vote. I think,
Yeah.
and so I think you're right. The Tories often do try to steer away from it, but when they've been at their most successful, 40 new hospitals in 2019, of course, then the
Mm,
competence issue about how many actually then happened, or
mm,
David Cameron in 2010, a couple of times in the election, I went to the front page of the Tory website and I just thought, well,
mm,
let me just check. I'm not just, judging this wrong from
mm.
within my bubble. And you thought, I can't find the NHS here.
No.
And it was buried in amongst stuff. But if
Yeah.
you think the predominant issue on voters' minds, state of
Yeah.
the NHS,
Yeah.
what was there? What was in the Isaac Levido strategy slide deck as to, well, this is how we're going to deal with it? We need Tim Shipman to write another book,
Yeah.
or
Or
indeed the book that
indeed.
you will be co-authoring.
Or indeed, yes, Rob Ford and Will Jennings and Paula Surridge and me. That's right.
Yeah,
I mean, hopefully we will get some interviews and find out, what was the
yeah.
strategy really. I mean, I
Yeah.
think
No, I
generally,
promise I won't wait 5 years before reading it when it comes out. I feel I should
I
add
mean,
that
generally
now.
speaking, it is a bit of a mystery as to what they were doing, and we will have to see. I mean, there will have been some rationale for what they were doing, and whether it was the correct rationale
Mm,
is another matter. We'll just have to see
yeah.
what people tell us.
Yeah. And I
Um,
mean, one possibility might be a bit like with the Lib Dems in 2015, that there was just no good message that would have worked.
yeah,
So
yeah,
the other, I do wonder whether it'll turn out that actually they were so short of money, they did relatively little market research compared to what they used to. And
mm,
because they're used to being able to rest on that quite heavily, they
mm,
were sort of left at sea with sort of, without the evidence and without the well-honed gut instincts. And
mm.
so,
Yeah,
but
and
anyway,
also, to be honest, without being prepared. I mean,
yeah,
they were just caught by surprise by their own leader,
yeah.
and therefore, had to probably do things on the hoof in a
Mm.
way that wouldn't have been the case
Yeah,
had they gone in the autumn. But we
yeah,
don't want to get into the timing of the election. We'll be here forever.
yeah.
Um,
Let's move on to the next factor that you identified, visibility. I mean, in a way, this is Ed and the bungee jumping.
yeah,
This is
yeah,
absolutely
yeah.
that spot on.
Yes,
Um,
I think that's right. And I was just going to say about the Greens. In some ways, polling was very important as
mm,
well for the Greens in the sense that it did make it very obvious that they stood a chance. For example, in Bristol Central, and that meant they some attention was paid to them. But interestingly, there were some figures out from the Loughborough team that look at media exposure, and it showed actually the Greens got very little media exposure compared, for example, to Nigel Farage, of course, who managed to garner an enormous amount of airtime and column inches, despite the fact that in some ways he was just the leader of one of a
yeah.
number of smaller parties.
Yeah, and one shouldn't, ever read too much insight into replies on Twitter. But I was quite struck. I tweeted after the election a message about the latest net approval ratings for party leaders. And obviously
Mm,
I chose to do that because Ed has got a positive rating and came out on top.
mm,
But it was striking the number of people who replied saying, "Who is this Ramsey person?" Now, of course, they could have Googled it and so on. But I thought it was interesting as a little sort of anecdotal insight into how low profile the Greens were nationally, even
yeah,
though, four MPs elected,
yeah, yeah.
that must have been right at the top end of any sort of dreams they had for their election result.
Yeah, I mean, I think visibility is important, but I think it's very, very difficult when you're the Green Party, to be honest. Although obviously they have got, in some senses, as their USP, an issue that a lot of people do think is very important. So to
Yeah,
some extent, they will
yeah.
get some, bounce off the fact that people know that the world's burning and we need to do something about it.
And Nigel Farage seems to have provided that for reform, although it's not quite such a straightforward story of he says he's taking over as leader again and they rise in the polls. The
Mm.
chronology is a little bit more complicated, but I
Yeah, it
think at
is, but I mean
heart
that it's
it's
going to be one of the big what ifs, isn't it?
yeah,
If Nigel Farage hadn't come back as leader, how well they would have done. I mean, my gut feeling is they wouldn't have even breached double figures in
mm,
vote share, but who knows? But certainly, I mean, yes, Nigel Farage in terms of visibility is just unchallenged. He just seems to be box office as far as the media is concerned. They just can't help themselves. There's something about him that they absolutely love. And of course, in some ways, it's to do with conservative supporting newspapers being, rather sniffy about Rishi Sunak and the party generally, and actually liking a lot of Nigel Farage's rhetoric and indeed, some of his programs, such as it is.
yeah. So there wasn't the sort of rowing in behind the Conservatives at the death by
Mm,
Tory newspapers that has been a very common pattern of elections in the past, was
mm,
there? There was that
mm.
to an extent, but there was a bit of, oh, actually, we quite like reform as well. It felt like that, they were pulled in two directions on that.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it doesn't really come over as particularly authentic if you spent a lot of time, talking about how great Nigel Farage is, and then right at the death, you sort of say, "Oh yeah, but vote for Rishi Sunak." It's just, yeah,
Yeah.
it doesn't really make
Um,
any
and then
sense.
your penultimate criteria was adaptability to circumstances,
Mm,
which I guess is probably a little bit less relevant for this election in that the basic landscape has been sort of in place for several years, really, of a very unpopular Tory
yeah,
party,
yeah,
a Labour Party that's well ahead on
yeah,
voting intention,
yeah.
but you probe under the surface a little bit brittle on things
Mm,
like
mm,
Keir Starmer's ratings except when you then compare them to Sunak. But, you know, a little bit of brittleness around Labour, a Lib Dem vote share comparable to last time, but with lots of hopes, as evidenced by local elections. By-elections are concentrated in particular areas, the SNP in real trouble. It feels like, I mean, there was a bit of adaptability to circumstances, I guess, in terms of Nigel Farage's re-entry to the stage. But other than that, it feels like, you know, this was broadly the sort of
Yeah, so I
election.
think the narrative was set. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember doing some talks before the election and confessing, you know, I'm now going to show you the most boring graph you've ever seen, and it was basically party vote shares from sort of a year and a half out from polling day, and it was just a, you know, completely sort of flat line all the way through, really. Yeah, so and not much change actually during the campaign, in the sense there weren't any kind of external shocks that people had to, you know, get their heads round and you know be fleet of foot on. Apart perhaps from the Conservative campaign, you know, because there were so many gaffes there. But you know, there weren't any things that people had to really kind of adapt to. There were no major kind of foreign affairs issues, apart maybe from Joe Biden's, you know, ongoing problems. But that wasn't something that really affected the election campaign here. So.
And I guess the Tory campaign did seem to adapt to, oh my goodness, this is going dreadfully. You know, they did adapt to fighting, you know, a much nominally safer band of seats.
Yeah, I mean, I think
And
that
probably they were
supermajority.
fighting in
Yeah,
the right place by the end of it, I guess.
yeah, I mean, I think the supermajority thing, I mean, much as I hate that word and much as it was apparently initially sort of accidental, I think probably did make a difference in the end, actually. I mean, I think you have to say that their vote share, you know, went up slightly towards the end. I think they probably pulled a few voters back. I think the fact that they just banged on about the 2000 tax, that probably helped as well. I mean, you know, I think you're right to a degree that in the end it ended up being about damage limitation and salvaging. You know, it was probably a kind of
Yeah.
reasonable success in that sense. You know, it could have been a lot worse, you know, but for that perhaps.
Yeah. So yes, all of this right wing banging on about tax and supermajority saved Jeremy Hunt's seat, perhaps, which would be slightly ironic.
Well, certainly. Or Jeremy. I mean, the other thing, people talk about Jeremy Hunt's shoe leather, but they don't talk about the £100,000 he gave to his constituency
Indeed.
party. I think it was 100,000. It's certainly quite a lot of
It
money.
was, yeah,
So you
very
know,
sizable donation.
yeah, which probably helped.
Yeah.
I mean, I
And it
don't
was
know what
certainly
their news
noticeable
fitting
from the
was.
Lib Dem perspective that his seat was one of the few seats where there seemed to be a proper, you know, something approaching a proper Tory campaign.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
in so many other seats, their campaigning was such a pale
Mm,
shadow, which
mm,
I think comes on nicely actually to your last point, which is about efficiency and professionalism.
mm,
And just thinking about, in that sense, the prospects for the Tories in this parliament,
mm.
their sort of level of organisational ability seems to have declined so far. And, you know, let's not forget in the May elections, a few weeks prior to the general election, they actually finished third in number of seats. You know, the
Mm,
general election wasn't just a freak in that sense.
mm,
That
mm,
if you look at the local elections and if you look at their campaign capacity, they seem to have some real problems.
mm, mm. I mean, it will be interesting going forward, and it comes back to something you've talked about, which is money. Actually, in order to, you know, run a professional comms operation for, you know, 4 years of a parliament, you need good people and you
Yeah.
need to pay them. You also need money to be able to, you know, spend on advertising,
Mm.
digital, etc. You know, they're going to find it quite hard to scrabble together donations, I would have thought, given how poorly they performed this time around, and you know how in some ways objectively low the chances are of them coming back, you know, after just one term. So obviously it does depend to a certain extent on the personnel that you have in Parliament, and it will be interesting to see if, you know, they are able to, you know, produce some new stars, as it were. But they have lost some very capable communicators. I mean, Penny Mordaunt, whatever you think of her, as a, you know, very competent communicator. Maybe they'll be able to get some of those people back in via by-elections. That's possible. But at the moment, you know, they're running a sort of shadow leadership campaign that hasn't quite started yet, which looks as if it might involve people, you know, tearing great chunks out of each other, which of course never looks particularly professional. But you know, parties can recover from those kinds of leadership campaigns, but they can sometimes leave obviously an awful lot of bruises that, you know, take a long time to heal.
Yeah. And I turning to that Tory leadership campaign, the thing I guess I've learned over time that is frustratingly opaque about leadership campaigns is that usually the candidate who is going to be, or the leader who ends up being most effective at modernizing and taking their party back to the center ground, is not the one who particularly makes that pitch in the contest. That you
Mm,
need to have, as it were, street cred with your more extreme elements in order to then be able to make that shift. And so, and you see this, on the international stage, you see it in international politics, the old cliche that it was only Richard Nixon, a Republican president,
mm,
who could go to China and put relations with a communist government on a new,
mm,
relatively warm footing, because a
mm,
Democrat would never have been able to do it. You see that in the peace negotiations in Northern Ireland. You see it in South Africa. Again and again, it's the person who comes from the extreme
mm,
who therefore has the political backing to
mm,
be able to, and the person who doesn't come from that,
mm.
very different context. Extreme means something very different in this world. But if you take the example of Theresa May, because she hadn't voted leave,
Yeah,
was she ever going to be able? And so I just wonder if, in a way, the next Tory leadership election is clearly important,
yeah,
but we just are all, trying to stare through fog in terms of working out who
yeah.
might actually be the person who's successful in a few years' time, because they probably need to say something that's a bit different now from
Yeah.
what success requires later.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, you can argue as a counter example that David Cameron came along and told the party what it needed to hear, and she got it back into government. But on the other hand, David Cameron's position within the Conservative Party was never particularly secure, which is
Yeah,
one reason why he had to, call the Brexit referendum in the first
exactly. He
place.
never got, and he only was able to do that after several defeats.
Yeah,
It was.
yeah, exactly. And of course, you can point to Keir Starmer, who had to say and do something completely different
Mm,
during the Labour leadership campaign, for what he ended up doing once he became
yeah.
Labour leader. So I think you've got a good point there, and that I think brings us to who might win this. And in
Mm,
some ways, I think is an interesting candidate. Last year, famously told Eurosceptics, "I'm a conservative. I'm not an arsonist." She might be the person who will be able to tell her own side a few home truths. The problem, I think, is she does seem to be a very, very convinced Thatcherite culture warrior, and unless the last few years have been complete cosplay on her part, it's quite difficult to see how she could suddenly kind of rip off the mask after winning and do something different.
yeah, and I guess the other question is whether she has enough support from the sort of hardcore Brexiteers, or indeed whether they matter enough, in this new world for Conservatives.
Mm,
In that, certainly there's a fair degree of criticism from some of the sort of Brexit fringes about, how Brexity is she really, etc.
mm, mm. Yes, absolutely. It's going to be fascinating to see. And of course, as you say, we're not only seeing through fog. I mean, if we assume that it might take a couple of terms for the Conservatives to make it back into office, I mean, we don't want to, I think, suggest that simply because Keir Starmer pulled off this miracle, it can be done by everybody every time.
Mm.
It could well be that whoever takes the Conservative Party back to government, if indeed that ever happens, I think it probably will happen, may not be taking part in this particular leadership contest.
Yeah, although I guess I mean, we don't have that long a track record, to look at of previous elections,
No.
but I guess I mean, Labour landslide in 1945, within 6 years, the Tories are back in office in 51. I mean, Labour's win in 66 wasn't really a landslide, but again, within 4 years, the Tories are back in office.
Mm,
Wilson's
mm,
win in 74 definitely wasn't a landslide.
no.
I mean, Tory, very big win, certainly in 79, and that does set up a long
Yeah.
sequence of Tory wins. And then you have the big Labour win in 97, a big sequence. But then, the first big majority of the Tories get subsequently 2019, within one election again. It's quite a mixed pattern, isn't it? That you
Yeah,
do.
it is quite a mixed bag, but you're quite right to say, as a statistician, it's such a small N.
Yeah.
It's very, very difficult, really, to pull anything out, or you can pull whatever you like out of historical precedent. I agree. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. I mean, historical precedent perhaps suggests that you should keep with your defeated leader at the next election, because what happened with Labour in 1970, Prime Minister ousted, they keep their leader and he wins at the next election. So you know write-in campaign for Sunak now. But what does the poll that you and your colleagues have done of Conservative members, what does that tell us on this?
Well, it tells us at the moment that Kemi Badenoch has quite a lead over the second place candidate, who would be Suella Braverman. But even then, I mean, support was only running at 31%. So that does suggest that there's actually quite a lot to play for. And that's removing the don't knows and wouldn't say. So, she's by no means yet nailed on. I mean, there were some surprises because for example, there's been a lot of talk in sort of Tory circles and newspapers about Priti Patel maybe sort of coming through and beating Braverman and Badenoch. She's very personable. Lots of Tories like her. She's been doing quite a lot of constituencies, but she only got 6% support. And then, there's another person who gets talked up all the time, Robert Jenrick, only got 7%. So I think sometimes the view of the media on who is and who isn't the front runner and who stands a chance, it's not always borne out by polling. But of course, things can change. I mean, we haven't even had official declarations yet, and some people might come into the race we haven't thought of. But I would have thought Badenoch's in a pretty good position if she, doesn't mess up during any campaign. I don't think Braverman is going to win, because I don't think MPs are going to put her into the final two. I don't think, by the way, that MPs will be able to, even if they wanted to, cut out the membership from voting. And I think that would be a very bad idea. I mean, coming back to what opposition parties need, they do need some grassroots boots on the ground. And I think if the Conservative Party were to cut the members out of the decision, that would be terrible for morale. I mean, I think they've probably already lost a fair few members over the course of the last year or two. I don't think they can afford, to hit, the existing members by cutting them out of the leadership race.
I also think I mean, I know people like Daniel Finkelstein make, an erudite and eloquent case for cutting members out, but I think the big weakness with arguments like that is, it was Labour MPs who decided to put Corbyn on the ballot. Look at the number of Conservative MPs who voted for Liz Truss. You can definitely do a bit of finger pointing at, oh, well, look, that person won the ballot of members when they shouldn't have. But you can do just as much finger pointing at, look at the number of MPs, though, who knew that person well. The argument is the MPs know the candidates really well. Look at the number of MPs who had known that person for years and picked them to be leader. Is giving that, that sort of person more power really the solution to getting better results from leadership elections? So
yeah. And when you think about what Conservative Party members actually get out of being in the Conservative Party, it really does come down to selecting candidates for local authority elections and parliamentary elections and selecting the leader. There is nothing else. They've got no say on policy whatsoever. So in terms of just, a sort of incentive based model for, recruitment to a political party, I think it would be a very bad idea. Although, personally, I'd probably take the opposite view from you, in the sense that I do think it ought to be left to MPs. But I think, once the genie's out the bottle, you're not going to get it back in there anyway. So you ought to make the best of it.
Yeah. Well, I guess I think one reason, apart from the record of MPs isn't great in Labour and Tories, I think the other actually reason why it is a good idea to let members have the vote, even though it didn't work out for the Tories, was actually that Truss-Sunak leadership election. Was part of the problem was that Tory MPs had chosen to put Liz Truss in the ballot. The other bit, though, is that contest then showed how mediocre a campaigner Rishi Sunak was.
Yes.
And obviously the problem then was you still had to choose between, Truss and Sunak. But if he had been up against a more credible candidate who had then done better, we would, now there would be a really powerful case to say, look, that's why you should let members have the choice, because you then have the campaign that exposes the fact that he's a mediocre campaigner. The Tories, though, Tory MPs, once again, I will emphasise, having seen Sunak fail as a campaigner, nonetheless then did decide a bit later to elect him as leader. So, in a way, the member contest had done its job. It had shown that he wasn't a great campaigner, and yet the MPs still picked him. So blame the
Yeah.
MPs, not the members.
Yeah, and coming back to the election campaign, I do think one of the very interesting questions that we will have to answer when we write this book, and people who
Yeah,
look at the election, in years to come, is why, when it was fairly obvious that Rishi Sunak was not the kind of candidate who could bear a presidential campaign, did the Conservatives still
indeed.
choose to fight such a presidentialized campaign? Now, it could be because all campaigns are now quite presidentialized and that's the way it goes. But it's an interesting decision. There wasn't much. This is the team around Sunak. Now, it could have been because all those people like Jeremy Hunt were back in their constituencies, desperately trying to hold on. But I still think, it's an interesting and slightly mystifying decision.
And it was a deliberate visual look as well. Is if you look at I like looking at the Getty Images website and
All
doing
right.
a search on the three candidate names at
Yeah.
different times in the election, because you get to see, all of the photos that just been taken. The Ed ones were always hilarious to look at. The Keir Starmer ones were always a crowd of Labour people in a football ground, it feels like.
Yeah.
The ones from the Tory campaign, though, is it really, Rishi Sunak was really quite a solitary figure in a
Mm,
lot of the images. So it's not
mm,
just that there weren't other Tories, but Tory MPs, because they were maybe off, as you say, fighting their own seats. But
mm,
the visual look they went for the campaign was one about sort of Sunak and Sunak alone, not like with say Starmer and a crowd of people.
mm.
Lots and lots of the Sunak photos are Sunak basically on his own.
Oh, well,
And
that's
and
fascinating.
that
That's a.
was that was yeah, and that must have been a deliberate choice about
Mm,
how they would running it. And yeah, as you say, it's a bit mystifying why there was
mm,
the view that that would succeed. But we should wrap up by
yeah.
just harking back to your final criteria
Mm,
and talking about a little bit about efficiency and professionalism in terms of Labour and Lib Dem. So I'd just
mm.
like to offer you the opportunity to say something nice about the Lib Dem efficiency and professionalism.
Well, you have to say that they exhibited it really. Clearly, I think that the professionalism and efficiency in the Lib Dems comes from the fact that they decided not to worry too much about vote share and concentrate on seats that you could win, and with a fair wind you would win. And there's absolutely no doubt, as far as I'm concerned, that you made that decision, quite early on, and it was the right decision to make. And associated with that, I think, was the decision not to use the phrase often associated with the Tory party, bang on about Europe. Because although clearly, that is something that people associate with the Liberal Democrats and probably was an advantage in those kind of, Remain Tory
Mm.
seats, it almost doesn't need to be said. And actually, what you focused on was something that Labour couldn't talk too much about because it didn't want to spend any money. And it played very well into Ed Davies' personal story. So, I mean, I just think it was, a really obviously efficient campaign. That's all I can say. I mean, Labour, in some ways, repeated the trick themselves. I mean, I think they will be disappointed to some extent that their vote share was so low, but they're not going to be that disappointed given how many seats that they managed to win. So in some ways, both of those campaigns were models of efficiency. And you have to say probably the same is true for the Greens.
Mm.
Reform a bit more random where they did and didn't win, I think.
And yeah, and as we've touched on, the Reform Party had more organisation issues come up during the
Yeah, and
campaign.
I've got to say, one of the things that will be really interesting over the course of the Parliament is whether reform can actually institutionalise, to use a
Mm.
jargon word, whether they can turn themselves into a political party that has an infrastructure on the ground that might allow them to win a few more seats next time around, even if their vote share is either down or not particularly impressively up.
Yeah. So I will end with, I think, my favourite stat related to the election, which is that in 1959, the Liberal Party won 6 seats, and it then took through to 2006 to hit the Lib Dem peak of 63 seats. So it took 57 years, sorry, 47 years to gain 57 seats in that long slog from 59 through to the 2006 peak. And in this parliament, or the parliament that's just gone, we gained 61 seats in just 5 years. So more seats in only a tenth of the time, which I think counts as efficiency and professionalism.
It certainly does.
So thank you very much for your time, Tim. I will include in the show notes a link to the details of the survey that you and your colleagues have just done of Tory party members, as well as to various other bits and pieces that we've talked about, and to your Twitter account, because like me, you are still a little bit of a reluctant holdout of tweeting now and again. But many thanks for your time, and look forward in another 5 years' time, maybe, to running through all of those criteria once again.
Thanks very much, Mark. Enjoyed it as always.